December 19th, 1944. The winter air over the Ardennes was sharp and colorless, a dull steel hue hanging low above the snow-covered forest. The ground shook with distant artillery. The Battle of the Bulge was in full fury. Amid the thunder of tank treads and the echo of small arms fire, a column of exhausted German soldiers trudged through the mud, their weapons discarded, their hands raised. For them, the war was over. They had been part of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, encircled near St. Vith. The attack that had begun with such confidence, Hitler's last great gamble, had collapsed into chaos. Supply lines failed, units scattered, and air superiority returned to the Allies. For these men, the once proud symbols of the Reich, the eagle, the swastika, the Black Cross, had lost all meaning. Hunger, frostbite, and exhaustion were now their only companions. An American sergeant, wrapped in a tattered wool coat, motioned for them to move toward a waiting convoy of trucks. "Move it," he said, his voice calm but firm. The prisoners obeyed, their boots crunching in the frozen slush. Some limped, others leaned on each other for support. One young soldier, barely 18, looked up at the sky as a formation of P-47 Thunderbolts roared overhead. "They own everything," he muttered in disbelief. WWII dusk. The trucks were moving west, toward the Allied rear, toward capture, toward an uncertain future. For many of these men, the word captivity carried with it memories of Soviet gulags or the brutal prison camps of North Africa. They expected barbed wire, beatings, starvation. But what awaited them in America would defy everything they had been told. For now, though, they sat in silence. The war's final chapter was still being written in fire and blood across Europe. The roads were clogged with prisoners. Tens of thousands of Germans, soldiers, officers, engineers, and Luftwaffe ground crews were being herded into makeshift holding camps. They were the broken remnants of the Wehrmacht, the sons of farmers, mechanics, teachers, and clerks who had believed they were defending their homeland from annihilation. As night fell, one of the American guards passed through the line of trucks, checking on the prisoners. He carried a flask of coffee and a blanket draped over his shoulders. "You fellas cold?" he asked, not expecting an answer. One German nodded weakly. The sergeant hesitated, then handed him the flask. The young man drank slowly, his hands trembling. It was a small act, almost insignificant, but it was the first crack in a wall of fear that propaganda had built for years. 2 days later, the convoy reached a rail depot in Reims, France. The prisoners were loaded onto troop trains, not cattle cars as some feared, and given rations: white bread, tinned meat, and coffee. American coffee, one of them whispered with disbelief. "Even their prisoners drink better than our soldiers." The remark drew a few tired laughs. From Reims, they would travel by sea, across the Atlantic. The idea seemed impossible. Captives crossing the ocean to the very country they had once been told was corrupt, chaotic, and racially impure. Yet in 1944, America held not hundreds or thousands, but over 400,000 German POWs spread across 46 states. They would be housed in military-style camps guarded by the U.S. Army, fed according to the Geneva Convention, and treated with an unexpected dignity that would leave a deep, lasting impression on those who survived. In early January 1945, one of these ships, the Liberty vessel Marine Falcon, left Le Havre carrying 2,000 prisoners. The sea was gray and rough, but the journey was orderly. American guards stood alongside German NCOs, both watching for U-boats that never came. One prisoner, Oberstfreiter Karl Dietz, later recalled, "We expected humiliation. We thought they would beat us. Instead, they gave us cigarettes." When the ship arrived in New York Harbor 12 days later, the city skyline rose from a mist like a vision from another world. The Empire State Building, the Statue of Liberty, icons they had only seen in propaganda reels twisted into symbols of greed. Now they looked on in silence. Even those who despised America's ideals could not deny the scale of its achievement. As the prisoners disembarked under armed guard, curious dockworkers paused their shifts to watch. Some of them had lost brothers and sons in Europe, yet there was no jeering, no violence. The Germans were processed quickly, deloused, photographed, and loaded onto trains again, this time for destinations deep inside the American heartland. For many, it would be Kansas, Texas, or Georgia. For others, Wisconsin, Alabama, or Iowa, quiet towns where the war seemed impossibly far away. The irony was not lost on them. The same men who had once dreamed of conquering the world would now spend their days behind fences, surrounded not by ruins or soldiers, but by open fields and farms. The first thing they noticed was the silence. No bombs, no sirens, no rubble. Only the hum of cicadas, the sound of wind through pine trees, and the occasional passing of a freight train. One prisoner wrote home to his wife, "It feels unreal. We are prisoners, but there is no hatred here." Inside the camps, the reality continued to surprise them. Barbed wire fences marked the perimeter, but the guards were relaxed. There were barracks with stoves, beds with mattresses, and even libraries stocked with books in German. Food arrived in abundance: bread, meat, potatoes, coffee, fruit. One officer stared at his tray in disbelief. "They feed us like soldiers," he said. "Even our civilians don't eat like this anymore." The Americans followed the Geneva Convention almost to the letter, partly out of principle, partly out of pragmatism. They believed that by treating German prisoners well, Allied POWs in Europe might receive similar treatment. But for the prisoners themselves, it was more than legality. It was a revelation. Propaganda had painted America as a land of chaos, racial decay, and moral weakness, a place ruled by Jews and money. Instead, they found a disciplined, organized society where even the enemy was treated with structure and decency. The shock of this realization would echo through every conversation, every letter home, every quiet moment in the barracks. As one camp interpreter, Private Walter Mertens, later said, "We arrived full of hate and fear. Within a week, the hate was gone. We couldn't believe how we were treated. But beneath the calm surface, deeper tensions brewed, both within the camps and within the prisoners themselves. For not all were ready to accept defeat. Among them were die-hard Nazis who saw kindness as weakness and sought to maintain ideological control, even in captivity. They formed secret groups, enforced loyalty, and threatened those who spoke too freely. For the Americans, this created a delicate balance, enforcing order without cruelty, discipline without humiliation. The camps became microcosms of the collapsing Reich, fragments of a nation still clinging to illusion, now isolated in the very land they had been taught to despise. By the spring of 1945, as the war in Europe neared its end, the camps were full. More than 300 facilities across the United States housed prisoners of the Third Reich. Some were built near farms to supply labor, others near military bases. But all of them, from Camp Swift in Texas to Camp McCain in Mississippi, told the same story of men raised in totalitarian darkness, now seeing another kind of world. One American guard wrote in his journal, "They come in broken and terrified. Then they see the camp theater, the soccer fields, the food, and they look confused. You can see it in their eyes. The question, how can the enemy be so human?" That question, quiet but persistent, would haunt many of them long after the war ended. By early 1945, as the war thundered toward its violent conclusion, the United States faced a dilemma few had anticipated at the war's outset. Across 2 continents, its forces had captured an enormous number of Axis troops, so many that Europe alone could no longer contain them. Nearly 7 million German soldiers had surrendered to the Allies by war's end, and a vast portion of them would come under American responsibility. Initially, the United States had no clear plan for how to handle them. The memory of World War I loomed large, when the Allies had treated German prisoners harshly and returned them embittered, fueling extremism back home. Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration and the War Department wanted to avoid repeating that mistake. So, rather than mass detainment in Europe's ruined countryside, they decided on something radical. They would bring them across the ocean to America itself. This decision would become one of the largest prisoner movements in history. From 1943 to 1946, over 425,000 German POWs were shipped to the United States, dispersed across more than 700 camps from Maine to California. The logic was partly practical. America had the space, the resources, and above all, the security. But it was also ideological. The U.S. saw it as a test, whether a democracy could hold its enemies not through vengeance, but through the rule of law. The German soldiers didn't know any of this. For them, captivity in America sounded like exile to the end of the earth. Nazi propaganda had described the U.S. as a nation of criminals and racial degenerates, where captured Germans would be humiliated and enslaved. Even among the Wehrmacht's more educated officers, the idea of humane treatment by Americans seemed absurd. They will kill us, or worse, use us for experiments, one officer reportedly said aboard a transport ship crossing the Atlantic. But when those ships arrived at ports like Norfolk, Boston, and New York, reality began to fracture the myth. There was no shouting mob, no gauntlet of guard with clubs. The prisoners were unloaded, given medical checks, fed, and quietly placed on trains that took them inland. The camps themselves were strikingly uniform. Rows of wooden barracks, neatly arranged within barbed wire perimeters, surrounded by fields or forests. Guard towers stood at the corners, but the atmosphere was far from oppressive. Many were built on existing U.S. Army training grounds. Camp Swift in Texas, Camp Butner in North Carolina, Camp Algona in Iowa, and Camp Clinton in Mississippi. Each camp was a small city, housing thousands of men. There were kitchens, laundry facilities, infirmaries, and even theaters. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners of war were to be provided food, shelter, and medical care equivalent to that of their captors' own troops. The U.S. military adhered to this with almost bureaucratic precision. Every German POW received clothing, blankets, soap, cigarettes, and meals totaling roughly 3,200 calories per day, the same as American GIs. They were even paid small wages for labor. For many Germans, this was incomprehensible. In the bombed-out cities they had left behind, their families were starving. Rations in Germany had fallen below 1,000 calories a day. Some POWs felt guilt when they realized they were eating better than their own civilians. One prisoner wrote in his diary, "We sit in warmth and eat meat while our wives stand in line for breadcrumbs. I cannot understand this America." The food was often the first shock. White bread, soft and sweet, was unlike anything they had known. Fresh milk, fruit, real coffee. They marveled at the abundance, at how easily Americans could produce what Europe now lacked. The guards sometimes joked that the Germans were gaining weight in captivity. The cultural impact of this treatment ran deep. In propaganda back home, Germans had been told America was decadent, divided by race, and ruled by greed. But inside the camps, they encountered a society that was disciplined, efficient, and strangely fair. The Americans did not strike them, did not starve them, and did not force them to kneel. Still, the U.S. military had motives beyond mercy. Treating prisoners well was not simply charity, it was strategy. First, Washington wanted to set an example that might influence how Germany treated Allied POWs. Second, it was about maintaining order. Content prisoners were less likely to riot or attempt escape. Third, and most subtly, it was a psychological weapon. The humane treatment itself became a tool of re-education, proof that totalitarian propaganda had lied to them. And in this regard, it worked. Within weeks, many captured soldiers began questioning everything they had been taught. They saw guards chatting casually, black and white soldiers eating together, American newspapers openly criticizing their own government. These were sights unimaginable under the Third Reich. They allow freedom of thought, even to their enemies, one astonished officer wrote home. The camps also became classrooms of quiet revelation. The U.S. Army organized education programs for selected prisoners, teaching them democratic principles, world history, and the structure of free societies. They read American newspapers and books, watched educational films, and attended lectures. While some dismissed it as propaganda, others began to listen. But this transformation was not without resistance. Among the captives were loyal Nazis, fanatics who viewed any accommodation with the Americans as betrayal. They enforced the code of silence, punishing those who cooperated. In several camps, murders occurred, disguised as suicides, when certain men spoke too freely about the futility of the war. The U.S. Army cracked down hard, separating the extremists into isolated compounds. Even so, the psychological contrast was unmistakable. For the majority, the harsh doctrines of Nazism began to dissolve under the quiet weight of experience. As months passed, they were assigned to work details, farms, lumber yards, and factories under supervision. America's labor shortage during the war had opened opportunities. Prisoners picked cotton in the South, harvested corn in the Midwest, and repaired roads across the plains. The Geneva Convention permitted this as long as the work wasn't directly military. Many American farmers, at first uneasy about enemy laborers, soon realized the Germans were diligent and respectful. Some even formed cautious friendships. One Kansas farmer recalled, "They worked like any of our boys. One of them gave my kid a wooden toy he'd carved from crate. I never forgot that." Such encounters left deep impressions on both sides. The Germans discovered ordinary Americans, not the caricatures of Nazi films, but people with humor, decency, and astonishing generosity. By 1945, the transformation was undeniable. Letters home, censored but still revealing, carried messages of bewilderment and quiet respect. "If this is the enemy," one soldier wrote, "then everything we were told was a lie." Yet behind the calm, the camps reflected the larger war of ideas raging across continents. For the Americans, every humane gesture was an assertion of principle, that civilization did not require cruelty to survive. For the prisoners, every meal and every conversation challenged the moral foundations of the world they had come from. The stakes were larger than the men themselves. These camps were not just holding pens for defeated soldiers. They were laboratories of ideology, the front line of democracy's moral argument against fascism. By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe was over. Berlin had fallen, Hitler was dead, and the Third Reich had ceased to exist. But across the Atlantic, hundreds of thousands of its soldiers still lived behind American fences, suspended between past and future, guilt and survival. Inside the POW camps, the atmosphere had changed. The gunfire had stopped, but another kind of battle had begun, a quiet, invisible war for hearts and minds. It was fought not with weapons, but with words, loyalties, and the haunting question of what it meant to be German after Hitler. At Camp Swift in Texas, the days were brutally hot. The Germans worked under the sun, harvesting cotton and clearing brush. From a distance, their khaki uniforms and disciplined ranks made them look like any military unit, but within their barracks, tension ran deep. The men were divided into two worlds: the loyalists, die-hard Nazis who refused to admit defeat, and the realists, those who had accepted the war was lost and longed to return home with a clean conscience. The loyalists clung to the illusion that the Führer still lived, that the Reich would somehow rise again through secret weapons or Allied betrayal. For them, America's kindness was nothing more than psychological warfare, an attempt to corrupt their German spirit. They painted swastikas on the walls of the latrines, held clandestine meetings, and kept a strict eye on any man who dared question Hitler's legacy. The realists, in contrast, had grown weary of lies. They had seen the photographs, the Allied newspapers, the reels of bombed-out cities and concentration camps. They had begun to doubt everything they once believed. But doubt was dangerous. Inside the camps, speaking out could be fatal. At Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, that danger became real. In November 1943, long before the war ended, a German prisoner named Johannes Kunz was found beaten to death behind the barracks. His crime: he had been overheard expressing sympathy for America and suggesting that Germany might lose the war. The Nazi loyalists in his camp saw him as a traitor. They held a trial, found him guilty of treason, and executed him with their fists. When American investigators uncovered the truth, they were shocked. 5 prisoners were tried by U.S. military court and executed. The event sent a chill through the entire POW system. The Americans realized that, even in captivity, Hitler's ideology still held power, a ghost that refused to die. In response, the War Department began a new policy: ideological segregation. Camps were reorganized into white and black compounds, not by race but by conviction. White camps housed compliant, moderate prisoners who had renounced Nazism. Black camps held the fanatics. This separation was both a safety measure and a social experiment. At Camp Ruston in Louisiana, the white camp took on a strange atmosphere of renewal. Freed from intimidation, many prisoners began to open up. They built orchestras, ran newspapers, and organized lectures. The Americans, sensing opportunity, encouraged these activities. Educational programs expanded. Courses on democracy, world history, and literature were introduced. Books by Goethe, Schiller, and even American authors like Hemingway and Steinbeck appeared in camp libraries. For some men, it was their first encounter with ideas outside the iron cage of fascist ideology. One prisoner wrote in his diary, "We thought strength was everything. But here, they speak of justice and freedom as if these were also weapons." At night, when the floodlights flickered across the fences, the men gathered to talk, quietly, cautiously. Some argued that Germany had been betrayed by its leaders. Others still clung to the notion of destiny. But the longer they stayed, the more reality intruded. They saw newsreels of Nuremberg, photographs of Dachau and Buchenwald, and the hollow faces of survivors. For the first time, many confronted the truth that their nation's cause had not been noble at all. Across the United States, similar transformations unfolded. At Camp McCain in Mississippi, an American officer noted, "We are watching the German mind unravel itself. The arrogance is fading, replaced by confusion, sometimes shame. But not everyone found redemption. In the black camps, resistance hardened. Fanatics held indoctrination sessions, sang Nazi songs, and tried to maintain the illusion of control. They believed surrender had been a temporary setback. To them, Hitler's death was a myth, and Germany would rise again once the Allies turned against the Soviets. These loyalists were often older soldiers, veterans of the early war campaigns, men who had seen victory in France and Russia. For them, defeat was unbearable. The propaganda they consumed for years about racial destiny, invincibility, and martyrdom had fused with their identity. To let it go meant losing themselves. The Americans observed this psychological fracture with both fascination and unease. It revealed how deeply ideology could shape reality. No amount of food or comfort could erase the inner prison some carried with them. Still, the tide was turning. The white camps became beacons of quiet rehabilitation. The War Department even began selecting certain prisoners for the Special Projects Division, a top-secret initiative designed to identify potential future leaders for a democratic Germany. These men received advanced education in political theory, economics, and ethics. They debated constitutional models, analyzed Allied propaganda, and studied the causes of totalitarianism. Many of them would later become part of post-war Germany's intellectual and political foundation. Teachers, journalists, and officials who helped rebuild the nation. For American guards, this transformation was strange to witness. They had arrived expecting hatred and danger, but most prisoners were disciplined, courteous, even grateful. A guard at Camp Algona wrote in his notebook, "They salute us every morning. They work, they study, they build furniture out of scrap wood. Sometimes I forget they were the enemy." Indeed, the craftsmanship of the German prisoners became famous. They built churches, carved wooden toys for local children, and painted murals inside their barracks. One such painting at Camp Earn in Texas depicted a peaceful countryside, rivers, forests, and small villages untouched by war. For the Americans who saw it, it was haunting. It's what they dreamed of, one officer said, a Germany that never existed. Meanwhile, American civilians near the camps grew curious. At first, many towns resisted having Nazis nearby, but over time, suspicion softened. Farmers who employed POW labor began bringing the men food and gifts. Children would watch through the fences, fascinated by the foreigners speaking in guttural accents. Their uniforms faded and patched. In some cases, friendships formed, cautious, forbidden, but real. A woman in Nebraska later recalled, "My father had German prisoners work on our farm. They fixed fences, harvested corn. They were polite boys. One of them cried when he saw our family photo, said it reminded him of home." Such encounters left deep marks on both sides. For Americans, it humanized the enemy. For Germans, it shattered the image of the ruthless capitalist state they had been taught to despise. Still, not all was peace. In some regions, racial tensions among the guards added complexity. German prisoners, accustomed to Nazi racial ideology, were stunned to see Black American soldiers in authority over them. Some reacted with arrogance, others with shame. Yet many grew to respect these men, who performed their duties with quiet professionalism. It confused them, one historian wrote later, to see the so-called inferiors upholding the law while they, the self-proclaimed masters, lived behind fences. In time, these small contradictions accumulated into something powerful. For the German POWs, the United States became both a mirror and a question, a place that reflected what Germany had lost and what it might become if it ever learned humility. By the winter of 1945, the ideological war inside the camps was nearing its end. The fanatic core had shrunk, isolated and bitter. The majority of prisoners had moved on. They played soccer, learned English, and waited for news of repatriation. Letters from home brought stories of ruin. Cities reduced to ashes, families displaced, hunger everywhere. The illusion of the Reich was gone. In one camp, a young soldier named Hans Muller wrote to his brother in Germany, "We are well fed, treated fairly, and even allowed to read American newspapers. Tell mother that the world she feared is not as cruel as she thought. If this is our enemy, perhaps we never knew our friends." Those words would later be cited in post-war studies as evidence of a phenomenon American officers called ideological disarmament. It wasn't achieved through propaganda or punishment, but through example. America, by simply being itself, open, organized, imperfect, but free, had undone years of totalitarian indoctrination. And yet, for all its success, the question lingered. What would happen when these men return home? Would they carry this new vision back to Germany? Or would the old ghosts reclaim them once more? That question would soon be tested, as the ships that once brought them west began preparing to take them back across the sea, not as conquerors or captives, but as witnesses to a different kind of power. By the spring of 1946, America's prisoner camps were quiet. The floodlights still burned over the fences at night, but the shouts and songs that once echoed from the barracks had faded. The war was long over, the trials in Nuremberg were underway, and the men who had once marched across Europe in the name of a thousand-year Reich were now waiting, not for orders, but for ships. The U.S. government had begun the massive process of repatriation. Tens of thousands of German prisoners were to be sent back to Europe each month. It was an operation as vast as the one that had brought them across the ocean 2 years earlier. But the mood now was different. The prisoners no longer spoke of victory or revenge. They spoke of home, though what home meant had changed beyond recognition. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, the final roll call was held on a damp April morning. The men stood in formation, their uniforms faded, their faces older. Some had grown rounder from good food and regular work. Others looked weary with the weight of thought. The American officers read the list of names, checked the rosters, and gave simple instructions. Pack only what you can carry. As the trucks rolled out, the prisoners looked back at the camp. The wooden barracks, the guard towers, the fences that had once symbolized defeat. A few waved to the guards. Others stood silent. For many, this strange, paradoxical place, a prison that had taught them freedom, would remain etched in their memories. The journey back across the Atlantic was somber. The Liberty ships that had carried soldiers to war and prisoners to captivity now ferried them home. The hold smelled of salt and oil. The sea was restless. There was little talk. The men crowded around the few radios on board, listening to reports from Europe, cities in ruins, millions displaced, the Red Army occupying the East. When they finally reached the ports of Le Havre, Southampton, or Antwerp, the reality of post-war Europe struck them with the force of a physical blow. Germany was gone, not just defeated but obliterated. Entire cities had vanished under ash and rubble. Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, Berlin, places they had once known as vibrant and proud, were now gray wastelands. The returning POWs were processed by Allied authorities, deloused again, and sent by train into what remained of their homeland. As the trains moved eastward through shattered landscapes, the silence deepened. Smoke rose from skeletal factories. Children played in ruins. Old women scavenged for bricks among the rubble. The illusion that they might return to a familiar world died mile by mile. In Munich, one former prisoner, a sergeant from the Wehrmacht named Otto Schaefer, stepped off the train and saw the remains of his street. Nothing was left but twisted steel and stone. He later wrote, "I have been captured soldier, and I return a beggar, but I also came back a man who no longer hated." That sentiment, quiet, restrained, almost ashamed, was shared by many. They had left Germany as believers in destiny and conquest. They returned as witnesses to its collapse. For those who had spent years inside American camps, the shock was twofold. On one hand, they were grateful to be alive, fed, and treated humanely. On the other, they faced resentment from their own people. Civilians who had suffered under bombardment looked at them with bitterness. "You were in America," one woman told a returning prisoner. "You ate well while we starved." The emotional distance between those who had endured the homeland's suffering and those who had lived behind American fences created a rift that would last for decades. The returning POWs carried with them a strange guilt, the guilt of survival through privilege. Yet, within that guilt lay something else, a seed of transformation. Having seen a world beyond totalitarianism, many of these men became quiet reformers. They returned with stories that contradicted everything Germans had been told about their enemies. "The Americans treated us as men," one wrote, "not as beasts." I must remember that. The U.S. government had anticipated this effect. The re-education programs conducted in the camps had not been accidental. Washington and London both understood that the reconstruction of Germany would depend not only on infrastructure, but on conscience. The POWs were the first Germans exposed to Allied ideals in practice, democracy, fairness, and tolerance. When they returned home, Their testimonies spread like whispers through the ruins. In cafes, in markets, in churches, they told stories of abundance, discipline, and decency, of guards who smiled, of farmers who shared food, of lectures about freedom. For many listeners, these accounts were shocking. It was as if the moral world had turned upside down. The irony was profound. The conquerors had become the teachers, and the captives, the students. But not all return changed. A minority of hardened loyalists clung to the myths of the past. They viewed the Americans' kindness as deceit, a trick to weaken German pride. Some even refused to speak of their time in captivity, ashamed of what they saw as surrender. They vanished into the anonymity of post-war labor, unwilling to face the truth. Yet history would not remember them. The ones who shaped the future were those who had learned. Many former POWs went on to become teachers, engineers, and local officials in the new West Germany. Their experiences in the U.S. had shown them another model of authority, one built not on fear, but on trust. One of them, Heinrich Alberts, who had been captured in France and spent 2 years in an American camp, would later become the mayor of Berlin and a leading voice for reconciliation. When asked about his time as a prisoner, he said, "They gave me bread and books. I discovered that strength without hatred is possible." In the years that followed, German veterans organizations would quietly acknowledge that the POW experience in America had helped temper post-war extremism. Studies by Allied psychologists noted that former POWs who had been treated humanely showed lower levels of resentment and nationalism than those held under harsher conditions elsewhere. Meanwhile, in the United States, most of the camps were dismantled. The barracks were torn down or converted into storage depots. Only faint traces remained. A few foundations, rusted gates, the outlines of old fences hidden by weeds. Local towns returned to their routines. The war that had once felt distant had, for a brief moment, come to their own backyards, and then vanished, leaving behind unexpected memories. In Kansas, a farmer named Henry Wallace kept a photograph of the German workers who had helped harvest his fields in 1944. "They were polite, disciplined boys," he said years later. When the war ended, one of them wrote me a letter thanking us. He said he'd never forget that America gave him back his humanity. Letters like that continued to arrive for years after the war, from Germany to small towns in Texas, Iowa, Georgia. Some were written in halting English, others in careful German script. Many expressed gratitude, others remorse. One simply read, "You showed us how to be human again." Back in Germany, the ex-prisoners found a nation struggling to rebuild itself not only from rubble, but from moral ruin. Hunger, displacement, and occupation defined daily life. But in the Western zones, where democracy was beginning to take root, their memories of captivity became quiet guideposts. They knew what it meant to live under tyranny and what it meant to see order without oppression. Historians would later call this America's most unexpected victory, a victory not of arms, but of ideas. By showing mercy where vengeance was expected, the United States had accomplished something no propaganda could match. It had replaced fear with understanding. For the men who had lived it, the paradox never faded. They had gone to war believing they fought for civilization. They returned from captivity realizing they had found it in the hands of their enemies. In 1952, a reunion of former POWs took place in a small town near Stuttgart. Several hundred men attended. Farmers, mechanics, former officers. They sang old songs, drank beer, and told stories of the camps in Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. One of them raised his glass and said, "We lost the war, but we found something greater. We found the truth." The others nodded in silence. The war had ended years before, but its lessons were only beginning to take root. When historians later pieced together the testimonies of these prisoners, a consistent pattern emerged. Again and again, they spoke not of violence or humiliation, but of the bewildering decency of their captors. They treated us like people, one said simply, and that was our undoing. For the United States, it was an unheralded triumph, proof that power could be wielded without cruelty, and that even in victory, humanity could endure. And for the Germans who lived through it, the memory lingered like an echo across generations, a quiet reminder that sometimes the greatest weapon in war is mercy. When the fences came down and the floodlights were turned off, the story of the German prisoners in America did not end. It merely slipped into the quieter pages of history. The barracks were dismantled, the guard towers torn apart for lumber, and the fields that had once echoed with German songs returned to silence. Yet the memory of what had happened inside those fences lingered, in letters, in journals, in the private reflections of men who had crossed an ocean as enemies and returned home as something different. In the years that followed, most of those former prisoners rarely spoke of captivity. In public, the narrative of the war was filled with heroism, suffering, and destruction. There seemed to be little room for stories of decency. Many feared that their countrymen, still scarred by loss and hunger, would not understand. To admit that life inside an American camp had been humane, even comfortable, felt like a betrayal of those who had endured bombings or starvation back home. But in private correspondence, another truth emerged. Men who had been shaped by Nazi propaganda confessed astonishment at the discipline and fairness they had witnessed. They wrote of guards who shared cigarettes, of farmers who trusted them with tools, of libraries filled with books they had once been forbidden to read. These memories formed a quiet counterpoint to the trauma of war, evidence that humanity had not vanished entirely from the 20th century's darkest hour. Historians later found that many of these men kept fragments of that experience with them for life. Some kept English dictionaries. Others preserved the hand-carved gifts given to them by American civilians. A few even returned to the United States decades later, not as captives, but as tourists, bringing their children to the places where their worldviews had begun to change. One former prisoner stood at the site of his old camp in Iowa, now nothing more than a wheat field, and told a reporter, "It was here I first understood what freedom really meant." In Germany, the influence of these men rippled quietly through post-war society. In the rubble of the early Federal Republic, they became teachers, engineers, administrators, mayors, and fathers who carried within them a living memory of another moral order. They had seen a democracy that functioned without terror, a nation that fed even its enemies, and they began to rebuild their own country upon those lessons. Sociologists studying West Germany's political culture in the 1950s and 1960s would later call this the prisoner effect, a subtle but measurable shift toward moderation and civic responsibility traced back to men who had once worn the Wehrmacht's uniform. Across the Atlantic, the American public soon forgot the episode. To most citizens, the POW camps were a footnote in a vast global war. Only local communities remembered the brief, improbable coexistence. In small towns from Texas to Minnesota, older residents recalled how German prisoners had worked the fields, repaired barns, or built roads. Decades later, some of those communities would erect modest plaques. Nothing grand, just a line or two acknowledging that enemies had once lived among them and left without hatred. For the soldiers who had guarded the camps, the experience had its own quiet legacy. Many of them had entered service expecting to confront evil. Instead, they encountered frightened young men not so different from themselves. The distinction between us and them blurred in the routines of daily life. Morning roll calls, shared labor, the mundane act of serving meals. A former guard from Louisiana, interviewed in 1980, reflected, "I learned that victory doesn't have to mean humiliation. We beat them in the field, but we didn't have to break them in spirit." That sentiment captured something essential about America's conduct in those years. The United States, still reeling from war yet confident in its ideals, had chosen restraint over revenge. It was a deliberate moral stance, rooted in both pragmatism and conviction, a belief that democracy proved its strength not through cruelty, but through consistency. Treating prisoners well was a statement of national character, a reminder to the world and to itself that power could coexist with principle. In hindsight, the gesture seems almost implausible. The same nation that had unleashed atomic fire over Japan also extended fairness to captured soldiers of the Reich. History is rarely tidy. Contradictions are its texture. Yet within that contradiction lay a profound truth. Even amid total war, the line between civilization and barbarism was drawn not by ideology, but by conduct. As the decades passed, the story of the German POWs resurfaced in memoirs, documentaries, and academic studies. Scholars combed through Red Cross reports, camp newsletters, and declassified military files, uncovering a narrative that complicated the simplistic images of friend and foe. They found evidence of theater performances, soccer leagues, and even joint Christmas services where American chaplains and German pastors prayed under the same roof. Each discovery added depth to a portrait of captivity that had become a dialogue between enemies. In Germany's collective memory, this episode became a mirror held up to the nation's conscience. The POWs testimony undermined the post-war myth of universal victimhood by showing that mercy had existed even in defeat. It also served as a reminder that moral choice had always been possible, that decency was not the privilege of victors, but a human capacity available to anyone who chose it. The Cold War soon overshadowed those reflections. As new lines were drawn across Europe, yesterday's enemies became allies against a different threat. Former prisoners now found themselves working within NATO frameworks, wearing suits instead of uniforms, cooperating with the same nation that had once held them behind barbed wire. In this strange symmetry, the moral victory of humane treatment revealed its strategic value. The goodwill forged in captivity became the foundation of post-war partnership. By the 1960s, as the world confronted new conflicts and new atrocities, historians began to re-examine World War II not only as a struggle of armies, but as a test of human ethics. Within that reassessment, the story of the POWs in America stood out as a quiet triumph. It proved that the Geneva Convention was more than a bureaucratic document. It was a moral compass that could survive even the chaos of total war. For survivors on both sides, the memory aged differently. Some Germans remembered the camps as places of reflection and rebirth. Others recalled them with ambivalence, torn between gratitude and shame. In the United States, veterans of the Guard detachments aged into obscurity, their experiences reduced to anecdotes told to grandchildren. Yet whenever those stories surfaced, they carried a common tone, not pride and domination, but wonder at how decency had endured when it might easily have vanished. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, a small ceremony was held at the site of the former Camp Algona in Iowa. Local historians invited surviving former prisoners to attend. A handful came, white-haired men with careful manners and thick accents. They walked through the reconstructed barracks, touching the wood, pointing to the places where they had once carved names or painted murals. An American guard's daughter laid a wreath at the memorial stone. One of the Germans spoke briefly in English. In this place, we learned that an enemy can show mercy. It changed us more than the war itself. The crowd fell silent. There were no flags, no anthems, no rhetoric, only the sound of wind through the grass where the fences had once stood. It was a fitting silence, the kind that belongs not to triumph, but to understanding. Today, the episode remains a reminder of what war reveals about the societies that wage it. The American handling of its prisoners was not flawless. There were mistakes, neglect, and moments of prejudice. But in the aggregate, it demonstrated a rare discipline of conscience. At a time when hatred could have justified any cruelty, restraint became an act of defiance against the darkness that had engulfed the world. For Germany, the lesson was more intimate. The men who had seen democracy at work in the camps carried that memory into the bones of the new republic. When West Germany built its institutions, debated its constitution, and confronted its past, the influence of those who had once been captives was quietly present. They knew, from experience, that authority could exist without terror, and that strength could be measured not in domination, but in restraint. In the larger sweep of history, the story of the German POWs in America may appear small beside the vast machinery of war. Yet it endures precisely because of its scale. It is the story of individual encounters, guard and prisoner, farmer and worker, stranger and stranger. Each moment a fragile act of trust in a time defined by betrayal. Through these encounters, a fragment of humanity survived. As the 20th century receded into memory, a former prisoner was asked by a journalist what he had learned in captivity. He paused for a long time before answering. "I learned that the enemy I feared was human," he said. "And once you understand that, you can never go to war the same way again." His words, quiet and unadorned, could have served as the closing line of any great documentary about the war. They remind us that history's meaning does not reside solely in victory or defeat, but in how we behave when we hold power over others. The United States had possessed absolute power over its captives and chose mercy. In that choice lay a fragment of moral clarity rare in wartime, a legacy that outlived both the camps and the men who built them. Even now, decades later, when the rusted fragments of barbed wire are unearthed by farmers' plows and the last witnesses fade into silence, the lesson remains. Civilization is measured not by its monuments or its armies, but by how it treats the defeated. In that measure, amid the ruins of the greatest conflict in human history, something enduring was preserved.